Okay, so round chaos, something I'm going to talk about. And this is something that Jordan Peterson was actually talking about, and he's one of the few people that mentioned it. And he said he couldn't find it anywhere else, so I'm like, well, I know what that is, so I might as well explain it. Okay, so this originally came from an idea way back when I was trying to figure out a minimum width. And I'll explain why that's necessary, because if you have anything that's constant in the universe, you need something that it's based on. So the speed of light is constant, so you need a minimum width in order to determine at what rate. So, because if you don't have a minimum width, then it might take 1,000,000 years for one electron to go the same distance another one does, because if they're not going off the same constant ratio, anyways, you understand the idea. So, electrons are perfectly spherical, which means, and they've measured them extremely accurately to a point where if it was the size of our solar system, if one electron was the size of our solar system, there'd be very little deviation from the circular shape. And the thing about computers is they can't calculate pi very accurately. So we've calculated it down to, I think, 2 quadrillion decimal places. So I was trying to figure out how is it that a computer could calculate a universe, because there's the idea that we're living in a simulation. So this is where this started. And I was like, well, I don't think that a computer can, because a computer can't calculate pi very accurately. And we have billions and trillions of electrons that we use even in just the devices that I'm using currently to record this. And obviously the universe is calculating pi extremely easily. So I'm like, is there a different way that this could be possible? And I thought, well, it's possible that it's a radius. So that's kind of the conclusion that I came to with how electrons, the universe was calculating electrons, is that it was a radius and not an actual sphere shape. So that's kind of what this drawing is supposed to indicate over here. And as we go over here, and now I actually thought, and I should cover this, is that the way that you would calculate a radius as a sphere is that you would rotate it. So I have an example here where a box is being rotated and a sphere, as you can see shown in the yellow dotted line, is emerging from as the consistent information, whereas this is unreliable information because it's always moving, so it'll never show up consistently. However, the inner circle is consistently shown because there's always a side of the box which is connecting with this inner circle. So yeah, that's how that works. So this actually brings up an entirely different piece, which is how it would have to be calculated if it's based on a radius, because, and this is something that's I'm gonna kind of go over briefly, but is much more complicated, is the idea of an intersecting plane, a perpendicular plane to ours. And the reason why that's necessary is because if everything was congruent and perpendicular, you could not transmit information over great distances faster than the speed of light, which is something that entanglement does, and I'll explain how that works too. So I'll try to explain perpendicular information in a way that makes sense. So imagine everything in the universe existing on a thread. And along that thread, in fact, I think I have sort of a drawing here. Along that thread, anything that's in the thread will relate to other things in that thread in a three-dimensional space. However, what I should add, there is a constant by which keeps that thread congruent, and that's the speed of light. So information cannot propagate within the congruent thread at faster than the speed of light. So the only way to do that is it has to go outside. Of that and become perpendicular information where it's operating on a different thread. And perpendicular information, since it's intersecting the entire three-dimensional space of our universe, every outgoing portion of information or element of information is intersected. And I have that shown up here, where you can see these lines that are perpendicular to the ones going out are the perpendicular information. So perpendicular information, when manifested in the parallel world, is seen as a sphere around that which is emitting the information. So for instance, an electron, it's emitting a negative charge, and the perpendicular information, which is what produces the sphere. Anyways, I think you kind of get it. And so I have a demonstration here where, well, a photon gets split inside a crystal, and then you have two entangled pairs. And they've done enormous amounts of studies to see, and well, that they stay entangled at extraordinarily large distances, probably the distance the size of a universe. In fact, I think they've taken light from stars and checked, and it's also been entangled. And so let me explain how this works. So the photon hits the crystal. It's one photon. It splits, so now it's a pair. According to the perpendicular information, at the point that it splits, it's still the same one. And you can see I have this circle drawn around it that intersects with the pair 1 and pair 2. So according to perpendicular information, it's still the same photon. But our observation within the parallel, or the congruent plane of existence, is we see two separate ones, because the intersection happens at two places instead of just one. So that's how that works. And so let's go down here, back to this idea of this spinning square. And the reason why I picked a square to spin is because in order for something to give off a consistent shape, it has to be stable. So if something is, and in my opinion, I guess what you would call the primordial building blocks of the universe are very impulsive. They come into existence, they come out of existence. And the only things that are that show up consistently and don't just disappear are stable structures. And those are the only ones that really form. So as you notice here, I have 4 intersecting force vectors. Now I'm simplifying it to just be force vectors so that this is easy to explain. So there's 4 force vectors that intersect, and because they're intersecting, they have information about each other. So if one tries to go out of existence, the other intersecting one brings it back into existence. And so what happens is they'd have to all disappear at exactly the same moment in time in order for it to go out of existence, and that just essentially probability states that doesn't happen very often. So like for instance, you see if 2 are only intersecting, then the probability of them going out of existence at the same time is enormously higher, exponentially higher than 4 intersecting. And so what that means is that they're temporary. So, but if these force vectors get locked in and they can't move, they'll shatter, essentially. They won't be able to exist. So, and we know that because we can't cool items down to absolute zero. Because if we stop an atom, you can't stop an atom, or else it essentially would not be able to continue to exist. It's just impossible, essentially. So what happens is these 4 stable force vectors, they rotate. And that's how they maintain movement. So, and another thing to be said on this is that if you have 2 particles in existence next to each other, the amount of space in between them, like for instance from these 2 here, even though that one's temporary, is less space for random force vectors to appear and disappear. So there's this sort of external pressure that forces them together. Now obviously this is a really simple explanation, but I believe you can derive some form of gravity from that, where stable things are drawn together, and unstable, because there's this huge enormous amount of push from the outside, but if there's only this much space separating you, there's only so much push that can come from there. So we're going to continue on. So that's why I chose a square to spin it. And so we're spinning a square and we get a circle. Alright, so now we need to progress. And here's where it gets a little bit interesting, but you're just going to have to go with it with me on this one. So I've got 2 pieces here. We'll focus on this one first. So a pyramid shape from the top is a square, right? And from the side it's a triangle. So, no, this might be a stretch, but it's important to understanding round chaos, so I'm going to explain it. There's 4 base forces in the universe. There's the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, and there's one other. I should actually just look that up. Oh yeah, and the gravitational force. So those are the four forces of the universe, right? So in theory, that would be these four right here. And if they come together, they produce stable reality, right? So a lot of our reality, our own personal reality, is determined by our eyes. So, and it's not just your physical eyes. So when you're asleep and you're dreaming, you have a pair of eyes and you can see things that you can't see with your physical eyes. You see the dream. You don't see a dream while you're awake. Most people don't, at least. And the idea is that you have actually four eyes. You have your dream eyes and you have your physical eyes. And that relates to your perception of reality, right? And then that forms the base of the pyramid. And when those come together at the top, when they're united, that forms the full pyramid. And instead of, and then there's the three parts, which is the observer, or you observing your thoughts, the impulses, or what you are observing, the impulse, and then that comes together and becomes the actor. So, how to explain this? If you're thinking something and you have an impulse and you observe that impulse and you say, no, I don't think that's a good idea, it goes away. So it's an AND gate, and logic gate, where both have to be true for an action to take place. But if you don't have if you don't have a united subjective experience and a united objective experience, so the dream and the reality has not become united, it becomes an OR gate. Or at least some of the time it becomes an OR gate, depending on what you're talking about, because there's a lot of different subjects, a lot of different opinions that you hold in your head, and some of them it's an AND gate and some is an OR gate. So in programming, OR gates, as long as there's one true, it'll act. An AND gate requires both truths. So an OR gate is where you have an impulse and you immediately do it without thinking about it or observing it. And that's obviously not good. That's not enlightenment. So the apex of understanding and control comes from where you are the observer of your impulses, and it is an AND gate the whole way, where you are always requiring both to be true in order for an action to happen. And that is when you actually have freedom of choice and you're an in control entity and you're not controlled by your impulses, because you're the actor, not the impulsive observer. So I'm going to take this one step further into a little bit. This is a little bit simpler. Maybe I should have started with this, but at the top, the single point is what you call order, or something that is fully known. And chaos is like a much broader base, because it can be a lot of different things, whereas order can only be sort of one thing. And that's why both are required to build the universe, because if you only had order, the universe would be this big. In fact, that's my theory of what it was before the Big Bang, is when order was all brought together in one place. And then I'm not actually sure how it shattered and chaos entered, and I guess chain reaction. But anyways, my thought is, this is a stretch, so just bear with me. My thought is, we believe that we're in control. We think there's freedom of choice, subjectively speaking. Objectively, we think there isn't. So in my mind, it appears that chaos is the potential for choice, and order is the strict law of how things work. And so it's my belief that the creation of the universe, quote unquote, had to be intentional, because the probability of it not being intentional and yet producing humans who are conscious and think that they control their intentions is zero. So if you have a universe where there are people and you think that you control your intentions and you think you have freedom of choice, then if that is the more probable explanation for a universe than non-existing at all, like why is there something instead of nothing, then I think that that's a strong indication that there is in fact freedom of choice, and that it was in fact a choice on some primordial conscious level for it to happen. That does not necessarily mean that it was a single consciousness or a divine consciousness or a consciousness that knew anything at all. It could have just been an impulse, an uncontrolled conscious impulse that had nothing to do, no plan, no nothing. And that's apparently what it looks like is, well, it exists, so it appears to be an impulse of some sort, quote unquote, whether that be natural or supernatural, quote unquote. And it appears that it's sort of random and unintentional, because a lot of things happen that you looking at it now would say, well, that probably shouldn't have happened. But in my mind, if there's nothing that can provide stability to consciousness, which is our memory, of course, we have memory and wiring in our brain that gives us a stable consciousness that has a base which to go off of, a root in the physical world, root to the quote-unquote tree of life, if you want to go down that route. That provides us the ability to see and understand a better version of reality than maybe what was available to primordial or the base substrate of consciousness at the beginning of time, quote unquote. Okay, that's a bit of a stretch, but we're just going to leave it at that. And then this is another interesting thing that you might want to look up if you're interested in chaos and order. It's something called the chaos game, and I'll leave a link to the Wikipedia page, I think. Yeah, so if you take 3 points and you roll a dice and you start plotting the points and you do point jumping, you end up with a shape that looks like this, which is very interesting. Some of you will recognize that. So, alright, now here's the really cool part. Here's where it all comes together. So if there has to be 2 strands, a perpendicular and a parallel strand, and they're rotated so that they form a circle, and those things go through time, it actually forms a double helix. And we see that in DNA. And DNA is, of course, evolution through time, which is really cool to think about. And I see that as being what Jordan Peterson calls round chaos. So that's my opinion on it. So that's how it all comes together. And I threw another part in there just because it kind of is related. So if you read Solomon, he talks about wisdom, and he says, wisdom has a house with 7 pillars. And I thought for a really long time, I was like, how can you have a house with 7 pillars? I understand 4, I understand 6. I understand how you can have an even number of pillars because you have 2 sides to the house, or multiple sides, or wings. But where do you put the 7th pillar? Like right in the middle or something? Like I didn't get it. And I'm like, oh wait, it's a circle. And they're all connected. It's a 7-point star. And I was like, wait a moment. There were 7 gods in Sumeria. And then something clicked, and I don't know where this is going, but I think I have a theory that these 7 gods represent order and chaos. And I believe I've got them in their right sections. Chaos being the base, or the 4, Enki, Anu, Nin-Hersagen, Enlil. And then on the other side, these are the other 3 that are supposedly of the 7 gods that decree. And I think they're Sumerian or Mesopotamian gods. I mean, they're all mixed together over there, so I don't really know. And I'm not sure. So that's why I wanted to add this in here. So if you guys have any opinions on that, or if you have some information that I don't. But I feel like there's some core piece of information that they're linked to. Actually, you know what? I think I put Anu on the wrong end. I think Anu and Inann should be flipped. Whatever. Anyways, so yeah, that's my conclusion to this sort of theory that I'm presenting. And this is actually a theory that I put together over the course of many years, starting with trying to figure out whether there's a minimum width, and then later determining if reality was a byproduct of different things interacting. And then from there I pulled perpendicular information, and from there I discovered that, well, it must be spinning in order to transmit circular information. In fact, I think that that's the only way you could simulate it in a computer. So if that's not the case, then we're living in base reality, and this is not a simulation, because I don't know how any computer could calculate electrons that are perfectly spherical and calculate pi to who knows how many quadrillion characters to get that sort of accuracy. I mean, maybe we could accurately measure the circumference of an electron divided by its diameter and see whether or not we get an approximation or not. But I'm pretty sure we're in base reality, and I'm pretty sure this is base reality, or the building blocks of base reality. In fact, I wrote a book that has most of these ideas in it, sprinkled around. I didn't directly talk about any of this, so that's kind of why I made the video. But yeah, that's round chaos. That's my take on it. So I hope you enjoyed some of the ideas. I know I didn't go into depth on very much. I kept some of the things simple because I honestly don't know with a lot of the things. I'm still working on those ideas and I haven't quite formed them. So if you like it, please let me know, because I'll make another video going more in depth as much as I can when I can. Who knows when that'll be. But if it doesn't get much response, I'm probably not. I'm going to leave it at this. So anyways, that's all I wanted to say. So that's the end of the video, I think.